Tonight for this lecture. I appreciate being with you and hope that you enjoy what I have to tell you. The topic for tonight is the difference that one can make. And let me start, before I get into some specific people I want to talk about, let me say that every time I hear someone say, oh, I'm only one person, how much of a difference can I make? I always want to kind of grab them by the collar and give them a little shake and say, wait a minute, there are lots of people in the history of humankind who have made, as individuals, huge differences in the way the world works and the direction that the world has taken. They've made a huge difference in the lives of other people. And to start out young in life, viewing yourself as only one person who probably can't accomplish much is really setting your sights rather low. I hope one of the achievements of this lecture, this time together tonight, is that you will come away thinking, wow, one person can make a difference. And you never know ahead of time what circumstances might thrust you into a position where, if you have the character, if you have the other things that may be required, if you have those things, you can make a huge difference in the lives of other people. I've chosen 4 people to talk about tonight, and they span really more than 2,000 years, right up to the almost present day. But the first one is a famous Roman from ancient times. He, if he's not the most famous ancient Roman, he certainly would be in the top 10 list of just about anybody who might be asked to name 10 famous Romans. Julius Caesar is probably number one, but he wasn't particularly a good guy. But the one I want to tell you about was a very good, very admirable person who made a difference. And his name was Marcus Tullius Cicero. And we usually just see his name with the last of the 3 names, Cicero, in print. And Cicero goes way back. He was born in 106 BC. 106 years before Christ. And so that meant that he was alive during the last century of the old Roman Republic. Now, if those of you who may know Roman history, you probably know then that ancient Roman history spanned 1,000 years. And the convenient thing about that is you can divide it in 2 parts, about 500 years of each. The first 500 years, roughly, is the period of the Roman Republic, when Rome rose from a tiny village on the Tiber River in the Italian peninsula to be the prevailing power throughout the Mediterranean world. And that was a period during the Republic when Rome, for the most part, enjoyed a considerable degree of liberty and independence. The Republic. They called themselves a republic, and that's because when they came into being in the year 508 BC, it was after a revolt against kings. And in that sense, they are similar to America. We were founded in a revolt against a king as well. And we established a republic. And our founders in the years that shaped America early on we're very acquainted with ancient Roman history, and we're very acquainted with Cicero in particular. We actually know more from his mouth and his mind than we do from any other human being who ever lived before the year 1000 AD. I mean, we know more, we have more written down that came from Cicero than anybody else. That's because he had a scribe through much of his public life who took extensive notes. And so surviving to this day are many of his speeches, his essays, his orations before the Roman Senate. They survive to this day and are voluminous. And still to this day, a fascinating read if you ever have a chance to read any of Cicero. But he was born in 106 BC, late in that first 500-year period. Now, if you're wondering, well, what happened after the period of the Republic? In the second 500 years, that's the period of the Roman Empire. which was an imperial dictatorship, with the first emperor being Augustus and a string of emperors right up until Rome fell in 476 AD. That was not a time of individual liberty, not like in the old republic. So Cicero, coming onto the scene in the first century BC, he sees the republic all around him, which he loves, but he also sees it crumbling. He sees civil wars arising. He sees people fighting over each other in the Senate and in the popular assemblies, and people trying to seize power and destroy the Constitution and to undermine Roman liberties. And he regrets all this, and he sets himself the task of trying the best he could to stop that decay, that decline. So that's the story I want to tell you. He became a lawyer early in his life, in his early 20s, and rather quickly earned considerable fame throughout Rome as a fantastic orator. He was one of the best that Rome ever produced. He could get up and off the top of his head give a speech that mesmerized audiences. And as a result, after being a lawyer and a prosecutor, he worked his way up the political ladder in Rome and ultimately came to hold the highest position in the ancient Roman Republic. It was called consul. He was elected to that in 63 BC. And in the old Republic, there were two consuls. The Republic wanted to minimize the concentration of power in the hands of any one person. So they always stipulated there had to be two consuls, and they could only serve 1 year, and the decisions of one could be vetoed by the other. So they had to come to agreement to get anything done. Well, that was one way that the old Republic tried to preserve liberty and keep the government from running amok and becoming a monstrous tyranny. So Cicero holds that position for the year that he is elected to. And some very tumultuous events occur during his 1 year as consul. He shares it, of course, with the other consul, but we hardly know anything about him. The other guy didn't make much of a difference or much noise, not like Cicero. But within a few months of taking office, Cicero discovers a conspiracy involving a prominent Roman senator and a few of his allies in the Roman government, a conspiracy to overthrow the Republic. I mean, this guy, his name was Catiline. He actually had an army assembled, and at his word, it was supposed to march on Rome and kill off a third of the Senate and declare Catiline as the sort of like a king or an emperor and snuff out the liberties of the Roman Republic. Well, Cicero learned of this, and being the diligent, studious lawyer that he always was, he didn't just come forth with a little bit of evidence. He did his homework and then went before the Senate and spilled his guts and said, hey, he's sitting right here, Catiline, right here in the Senate. He's aiming to call his army to take over Rome. And before Cicero was finished with that speech, Catiline fled the Senate. And that set the stage for a battle. Catiline called his army towards Rome. Cicero rallied Romans to defend the city and the Republic, and Catiline was defeated on the battlefield. And Romans were so grateful to Catiline, or to Cicero, for having saved the Republic, that they named him Father of the Country by official decree of the Senate. And you might say, well, given the enormous power that he was granted on top of those he already had as consul to deal with this conspiracy, you know, how could a man like that walk away from power when his year was up? But that's exactly what Cicero did. He walked away from power, sort of like what George Washington famously did. When he was, some soldiers said, you should be king, we'll come to your aid and make sure you're named king. And he said, that's not why I'm fighting. And you're missing the point. And I would never be a king. I would abdicate if anybody named me king. And well, in a very real sense, Cicero had done the same. He was sort of the George Washington of ancient Rome. Well, after his year as consul, Cicero had hoped to retire. And for a brief time, he actually did. And he started writing again more than ever before. One of his books that he wrote, by the way, becomes the second. In those days, what we call books today were actually put on scrolls, not yet a book as we know them today. But when Gutenberg invented the printing press many centuries later in the 1450s, the first thing Gutenberg printed on his new printing press was the Bible, but the second thing he printed was a work of Marcus Tullius Cicero. That's how highly regarded Cicero was 1,500 years after he lived. Well, so Cicero's writing, and he still sees all around him the Roman Republic is in decay, people are fighting, and there are generals who are trying to take over, and it's a very sad situation. He thinks that Romans are in the process of losing their liberties. And of course, it's in this period that Julius Caesar enters the picture and uses his army to threaten the Senate and threaten Rome. And in fact, because of that threat, he is briefly named a dictator. Some people say, well, that's the end of the Roman Republic, except Caesar didn't last very long in that position. As you may know, he was assassinated on the steps of the Senate. And so there was still hope that the republic of representative government, not dictatorship, could be saved. But succeeding Julius Caesar was one of his allies, Mark Antony. And Antony had no interest in restoring the republic. He wanted all power for himself. And that's what he was maneuvering to accomplish in the wake of Caesar's assassination. So it's at this point that Cicero, an elderly man at this point, comes out of retirement, goes before the Senate, and in a series of 14 speeches, you can read them today, every one of them. They're known as collectively as the Philippics. He gave these 14 speeches denouncing Mark Antony as a dictator in waiting, a tyrant in the works. Romans must come to their senses and keep this from happening, or they'll lose their liberties. I mean, these are brilliant speeches. Now, you might then say, well, what was the effect? Mark Antony never really held the top position for very long, but that's not because of Cicero so much as it was one of Antony's rivals, Octavian, who later becomes the first dictator. But Cicero is the target of Mark Antony because of those speeches that he gave. Mark Antony dispatches some assassins to kill Cicero. And in December of 43 BC, the assassin found his mark, and Cicero was beheaded. Now, you might say, looking back, that he didn't accomplish much. After all, the Roman Republic, within a few years, was gone. Octavian defeats Mark Antony, declares himself, in all but name anyway, a kind of emperor, and the Republic ceases to exist. And now you have a dictatorship for the next 500 years until it so weakens itself, it succumbs to foreign invasion. But I give Cicero a lot more credit than that. I mean, he may have held off a dictatorship by just a few years, but the difference that he made is actually with the passage of time. Cicero was such an example to lovers of liberty for centuries that all the way up to and including America's founders, he was referred to, he was copied, he was studied. Our founders looked at what he tried to accomplish and said, maybe we can improve on that. Maybe we can establish a republic with the best of what Rome had, but make some improvements and keep it longer than Cicero was able to. But it was the example of Cicero of courageously coming forward and speaking truth to power, even though it cost him his life, that set an example that people admired for centuries and still do. There are many books about Cicero because of his courage. He was a great lover of individual liberty and a Republican form of government. That's with a small r, meaning that not in a party sense, but rather a government in which people elect their representatives and give them some power, but never total power, to make laws for society as a whole. That's much different than dictatorship, where one man or a handful of people tell everybody what to do. So think of Cicero as a man worthy of remembering and admiration because of what he did on behalf of liberty. I mean, he had plenty of money late in his life. He had a very illustrious career. He could have retired and kept quiet and maybe lived another 10 or 20 years. But the Republic meant so much to him that he came forward and was the last prominent Roman to defend the liberties of the old Republic. So that's Cicero. Now I want to move to a much more recent history. I want to tell you something about a man I regard as my favorite U.S. president. We've had, including the current one, 46 presidents of the United States. So far, all men. My favorite of them, and that's not to say necessarily that I think he was the best. It's just he's the one I most enjoy studying. But I certainly rank him among the top half dozen of the very best presidents. And he's the only president to serve 2 terms that were not consecutive. He served 1 term, ran for re-election and lost, then came back 4 years later, ran again and won the second and served a 2nd term, but those not consecutive. His name was Grover Cleveland. We all know him by that name, but he was actually born Stephen Grover Cleveland, but at an early age, he sort of dropped the Stephen and everybody knew him as Grover. And so that's what he went by, even as president of the United States. If you know much about him, you may think of him as a politician from New York, because that's where he served as a mayor and also as governor before being elected to the presidency. But he was actually born in New Jersey, northern New Jersey, a little town called Caldwell, southwest of New York City. And his home, in which he was born in 1837, is still there. It's a Grover Cleveland Museum. You can go through it. And among the many artifacts that had been a part of his time in office is a piece of the inauguration cake from 1885. It's under glass. It doesn't look very appetizing, but it is a leftover piece of the official inaugural ball cake when he was sworn in as president in 1885. But as late as 1880, Grover Cleveland did not have a national reputation. Just 4 years before being elected president of the United States, the only thing he'd ever been elected to was sheriff of Erie County, New York, which is near Buffalo, New York, is part of Erie County. He was sheriff for 1 term, and then he went back into law practice. And then in 1880, he was elected mayor of Buffalo, where he quickly earned a reputation as the veto mayor because he vetoed proposals put forth by the city council all the time, usually because they were corrupt. He was as clean as a houndstooth, you might say. He was always fighting corruption in government. There was one time during his tenure as mayor where he vetoed a bill that would have put out a contract, $420,000 contract to a private company for, excuse me, garbage collection, I think it was. And Cleveland vetoed it. He said, this is full of kickbacks for city council people. I'm going to start from scratch. And he ended up contracting with another company to do the same thing for a savings of about $200,000, almost half of what the council was going to spend on that. That's the kind of thing he did all the time as mayor, which got him the attention of people statewide. And so in 1882, the party, which his party was the Democratic Party at that time, very different from today's, the Democratic Party came to him and said, we want you to run for governor of New York. And so he kind of reluctantly said, all right, I'll do it. And he was elected. And then 2 years later, after having the same kind of time as governor of New York as he did as mayor, cleaning up corruption, He, by that point in 1884, had earned a national reputation, and lots of people thought that Washington was full of corruption. So he got the Democratic Party's nomination and won the White House. He was the first Democrat to win the presidency since James Buchanan in 1856, which was before Abraham Lincoln in 1860. From beginning with Lincoln and all through until Grover Cleveland in 1884, all the presidents were Republican. But Cleveland wins in 1884, becomes the 22nd president of the United States. And in short order, he becomes known as the veto president. In fact, before he's done, when you add up the vetoes of his first term and then his second term in the 1890s, he will veto more bills than all the previous presidents combined. To this day, he's number 2 in all U.S. presidents in terms of the number of vetoes that he cast in office. The only one who beat him was Franklin Roosevelt, who had 3 terms and part of a 4th. But Cleveland is the number 2 record holder, and he only had 8 years to do that. Well, you might say, okay, well, where did he stand on issues? What didn't he like, aside from being opposed to corruption? Cleveland, in my opinion, was right on just about everything. He was for free trade with the nations of the world, which meant that he was opposed to high tariffs. He wanted to reduce tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods. He was also for sound money at a time when there were a lot of people who said, we have to have the government print a lot of paper money. And Cleveland said, no, that's just inflation. That just erodes the value of all the dollars in existence. So he said, no, we're going to have sound money so that the purchasing power of the dollar will not be eroded by soaring prices. And he was also in favor of America sort of watching over its own affairs and staying out of foreign conflicts. This is the time, of course, years before Teddy Roosevelt, who felt we should, go to war just about everywhere. Cleveland said, no, let's keep America strong, but otherwise, to the extent we can, let's keep out of the affairs of other countries. He was also for low taxes. He was for balanced budgets, which he had almost every year of his presidency. And he also became, by the way, the first American president to be married in the White House. In 1886, he married a young lady that he had known for some time. He was 49 as the president that year, and she was 21. 21. You might think, well, did that cause a kind of scandal? But it didn't. He truly loved her, and they had a wonderful marriage, producing 5 children. And she became a very much beloved First Lady of the United States. But Grover was the first president to marry while serving in the White House. I'll tell you one more thing about him because it's so remarkable. In his second term, I should back up. I didn't tell you why he lost in 1888. When he ran for re-election, he actually won in the popular vote, but he lost in the Electoral College. But he took it very well when he was asked by reporters, well, what do you think? You got more votes than the other guy, but you're not going to be president again. And he said, those are the rules. That's what we all play by the rules. You have to win in the Electoral College, and it's there for a reason. So he didn't make a big fuss about it. But in 1892, when the man he'd beaten, or who beat him, Benjamin Harrison, was running for re-election as president, Cleveland came out of retirement to run against him again. And in 1892, he beat Harrison and became president a second time. Well, early in his second term, there's a panic in the economy, largely because of some terrible legislation passed during the Harrison years that caused inflation and huge subsidies for silver interests in Western states and so forth. But there was a panic in the country, and an economic depression was just months away. And Cleveland knew what had to be done. He had to call the Congress into special session to repeal some of that legislation that had caused the problem, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in particular. And he was about to do that in June of 1893 when he discovered a lump in his mouth on his upper palate. And he thought he'd better see a doctor before he did anything else. And lo and behold, they diagnosed it as a malignant tumor. And it was urgent that he be operated on for removal of that tumor. But because the panic was underway in the economy, the stock market had crashed, Cleveland didn't want the country to, go into a panic further over the president's health. So he said, let's do it, but let's do it secretly. And so the word was put out that the president is just going on a yacht for a vacation on the East Coast near New York. But it was on that boat that the team of physicians cut a hole in his upper palate, removed the tumor, which was the size of a golf ball, and built a prosthetic of vulcanized rubber to replace the hole, put that in place, and they got it all. They never had a recurrence of that tumor. And by the way, if you want to know a little weird trivia, that tumor, size of a golf ball, is in a jar in the Mutter Museum of Medical Oddities in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So if you ever go to that museum, you can see Grover Cleveland's tumor in a jar. Kind of gross, but I thought you'd want to know. So as soon as the operation was over, he called the Congress into special session to repeal the worst of the legislation, and he succeeded. It was a very tough fight, but he succeeded in getting the Congress to repeal that harmful legislation by the fall. And to this day, to the extent historians talk about him at all, it's a shame they don't talk about him more. He's given credit universally as being a man who stood for something and stuck by it. He was a man of principle, and he saved the country from much greater harm had those laws not been removed from the books in 1893. And that he was an honest man from the word go, maybe the most honest man ever to hold the office. And maybe that was in part because his father was a Presbyterian minister and instructed him early to stand for the truth. And Grover Cleveland certainly did. And so I look back on him as a great American president. I happened to meet his son in 1995. Would you believe? You might think, 1995? How could you meet the son of a man who'd been dead since 1908? Grover Cleveland died in 1908. Well, in 1903, Grover, as an ex-president, Grover and his wife had their fifth child. That's the one I met, who was 92 years of age in 1995. And I said to him, his name was Francis, same as his mother. And I said, Francis, you have to know what a thrill this is for me to meet a man whose father is not only a person I greatly admire, but whose father was first elected president of the United States 111 years ago. I mean, think of this. 1884, Grover Cleveland's elected president. And in 1995, I'm talking to his kid, to his son. And well, when Francis was born in 1903, Grover, as an ex-president, was 67 years of age. So that's why. And you could still have someone living after that long span of time. Well, when I said that to Francis, the first thing he said was, oh, that's nothing. Cleveland's, like my father, tend to marry late and have children late. And he said, my grandfather, Grover's dad, was a baby when Thomas Jefferson was in the White House. And I remember thinking, what a young country that you could be talking to someone in 1995 whose grandfather was alive when Jefferson was president. So Grover Cleveland, he's been the subject of some recent and very good biographies too. One by Ryan Walters and another one more recent, just came out, I think, last year by Troy Senik, S-E-N-I-K. Either of those two are excellent biographies of Grover Cleveland if you're interested. The third person I want to tell you about is a woman by the name of Vivian Kellems. Vivian Kellems, Kellems. Any of these people, by the way, if you go to fee.org and type in their names, you'll see a lot of articles, some by me, some by others, about them. Vivian Kellems was born in 1896. And she turned out to be a remarkable inventor and businesswoman, very successful businesswoman who also had a very public career. In the 1920s, she and her brother invented what is known as the Kellems cable grip. Cable grip. It was a device for lifting and supporting heavy electrical cables that would be suspended from bridges or other infrastructure. And she created a company. She could have just invented it and walked away, probably a rich person just for that alone, but she started a company to market it. And she sold it all over the country and became a multi-millionaire selling this great new invention, the Kellems cable grip. And by the time of World War II, she had about 1,000 employees in Stonington, Connecticut, where she established the company. And she started to make a very public name for herself when the war came, because she didn't like withholding taxes, which were temporary and voluntary at first, but later made mandatory. Withholding taxes, of course, are when your employer takes taxes out of your paycheck before he makes the check out to you. And so you never really see that money. It goes, you pay it, but the employer pays it for you directly to the government because he withholds it from your check every payday. Well, she didn't like that. She thought that the government should send everybody a personal bill, preferably once a year, for their share of the costs of government. That way we'll know exactly what it's costing us, and we can decide more carefully if we really want that much of it. And she also thought that employers shouldn't be unpaid tax collectors for the government. Let it do its job of collecting taxes. Well, she fought that for a long time, but ultimately in 1973, she lost that battle. And we, of course, have withholding taxes and have had them ever since as mandatory. But I want to tell you about one battle she fought where she made a huge difference and she won. And that was when the state of Connecticut, where her business was, the legislature there decided to pass a law saying that no woman could work at a place of employment. No woman could work after the hour of 10 p.m. Which sounds kind of odd. I mean, you couldn't be an all-night restaurant waitress, for instance, after this law passed. And it singled out women. Only women could not work any place after 10 p.m. Well, Vivian Kellems had a lot of women working for her, but she didn't have a night shift, so it really didn't affect her. But she and the women who worked for her resented the idea that the government could tell them when and at what time they could work. So she created a night shift for any woman who wanted to work it. And most of her employees showed up for it because they wanted to press the point. They wanted the government to realize that they shouldn't have done this. And she held a news conference with all these women employees behind her. And she says to the press, directly to the government, to the state legislature, she says, "We're violating your law because you have no business telling us at what time of day we can work. Come and get me." And by that point, she was such a scrapper. She was known as a real fighter, and you didn't want to tangle with her if you could avoid it. Nobody sent the cops to her factory to arrest anybody. And that disappointed her because she wanted to have standing before a court of law. She wanted the cops to come and arrest her. In fact, she issued a statement at one point saying, "Please indict me." She wanted to go into a court and prove that law was unconstitutional. So when no police came to enforce it, she gets this idea, and keep in mind, she's a multimillionaire at this point. She decides she's going to get a job as an all-night waitress at a local cafe. Apparently the owner was sympathetic and hired her to work all night. And she held another press conference and said, "Come and get me." And within 2 days, the legislature repealed that law that said women couldn't work after 10 p.m. So she made a difference, and that's because she was courageous. She spoke out. She spoke truth to power. But it raises a question that each of you should at some point in your life think about, and that is, when is it appropriate to engage in what could be called civil disobedience, to break a law that you think is wrong? And I don't intend to address that in this topic. I just wanted to share with you what one woman did because of her feelings on the matter. And I think she argued too that by breaking the law, she wasn't harming anybody in the process. But it certainly had the intended effect. It caused the legislature to rethink and to repeal that law. Now, the fourth person I want to tell you about, and maybe spend a little more, at least 10 or 12 minutes on, is the only one of the four tonight who I actually knew personally. I would take groups of students, I think a half a dozen times, to England to visit with him. He lived outside of London. Did that a half a dozen times right up until the very month, May of 2015, when he had his 106th birthday party. He's the oldest person I've ever known. And as I say, the last time I saw him was 2 months before he died, on his 106th birthday. And he was still very sharp mentally. He was reciting poetry off the top of his head from memory. His name was Sir Nicholas Winton, W-I-N-T-O-N, Nicholas Winton. A remarkable man who became a hero and was so acknowledged, not only in his country of Great Britain, but throughout Europe, and especially in Czechoslovakia, which is now two countries, Czech Republic and Slovakia. Here's what he did that made him so heroic. You have to wind the clock back to the year 1938. Nicky Winton, he went by Nicky as a nickname, was a 29-year-old stockbroker in London in 1938. And that was the last full year of peace before the outbreak of the Second World War, which started on the 1st of September, 1939. And 1938 was a tumultuous year. In March of that year, Adolf Hitler in Germany grabbed Austria without firing a shot. And then during the summer, he started rattling his saber against neighboring Czechoslovakia. He wanted the Czechs to give up a border region called the Sudetenland. And many people in the world thought war was imminent, that Hitler was not going to back off, there wouldn't be a settlement, and the whole of Europe would plunge into war, which it did a year later. But in 1938, with war threatened, there was a big famous conference in Munich, Germany, September 1938, where the British and the French sat down with Hitler from Germany, and in a brazen act of what we now call appeasement, gave him what he wanted. They said, okay, you can go ahead and take the Sudetenland, that chunk of Czechoslovakia, but don't go any further. We won't do anything if you just take that much. And so they gave in, and Hitler grabbed the Sudetenland. Well, for a brief time after that conference, much of the world breathed a sigh of relief that, oh, we averted war. Of course, the Czechs weren't very happy because about a quarter of their country was just gobbled up. But at least it looked as though Europe would not plunge into warfare. Nicky Winton, he knew what Hitler was all about. He really thought that war was imminent, that Hitler wouldn't stop there. And of course, he was right. But he Nicky Winton, nonetheless planned a winter vacation in Switzerland at Christmas time, December 1938. Before he left England for Switzerland, a friend of his who worked in the British Embassy in Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic, contacts him by telephone and says, Nicky, don't go to Switzerland, come here instead to Prague. It's, part of Czechoslovakia that Hitler hasn't taken. Come here, there's something I want to show you. And so he consented and he went to Prague. And what his friend wanted him to see and to tour were the refugee camps in and around Prague, full of thousands of mostly Jewish families who had fled the Sudetenland when Hitler marched in. Some of them had fled Nazi Germany, some had fled Poland, Austria, knowing that what Hitler was all about and that they were in harm's way if they stayed. But they get to Prague at the start of winter and there's nothing. They're living in tents on freezing ground in the midst of snowstorms. Nicky walks through these freezing camps and sees all these people, these families. Some of them are carrying babies in their arms. And what happens? Many of these families, the parents of children, they come up to him. He's a perfect stranger, but they realize when they hear him speak, he's from England, he's from elsewhere. Maybe he can help us. No country would take the adults. And it wasn't at all clear that any country would even allow these refugee children to get in. But these parents come up to Winton and say, please take our children to safety. Now you can imagine how desperate a mother or a father would have to be to approach a perfect stranger and say, take my child out of this country to England or wherever you can get him or her to safety. Well, Nicky Winton could have said, sorry, I wish I could help. I'm only one person. What can I do? I'm supposed to be on vacation. See you later. Good luck. But he didn't. He was a man of character. He saw the need. He just dropped everything. He sent telegrams and letters to governments all over the world saying, please, can you take the children? If I can get them out, will you allow them to enter your country? Guess how many countries in the fall of 1938 and early 39 responded with a yes? Only two, his own Britain and Sweden. And because Nicky felt war was going to come, Hitler wasn't going to stop with the Sudetenland, he had to work fast. And he had to not only raise the money to get these children on a train to the coast and then by ferry over to England, a few of them up to Sweden, he had to find foster families who agreed in advance to accept the children into their homes. I mean, this is a monumental task with the clock ticking. Well, in the end, before it's all over, he was able to organize 8 rail transports and save 669 children, some of them babies, by getting them out of harm's way and mostly to England, with a few going to Sweden. And he couldn't talk about this for 50 years because of what happened to the 9th of the rail transports. He had the largest group of children already spoken for by foster families in Great Britain. He had 250 of them waiting at Prague rail station in Prague, Czechoslovakia on the 1st of September, 1939. They were ready to go, but that's the day that war broke out and the Nazis stopped all rail transports, and not a single one of those 250 children survived. And most of those who did, of the 669 that he was able to save, the vast majority of them never saw their parents again. They were taken to concentration camps. So Nicky Winton, one man, saved 669 lives. And if you add up not only those lives, but the lives of those children's children and their children, I mean, all the generations born since, that figure now is in excess of 6,000 people. 6,000 people, and among them are medical doctors and scientists and Nobel Prize winners and a member of parliament, none of whom would have ever survived or even come into existence had it not been for the efforts of this one man. And why did he do it? Not for fame, not for fortune. I mean, he could have written a book right away and cashed in on it, made a lot of money, and the world would have loved to have heard the story so many decades before it ultimately did. But that's not why he did it. In fact, as soon as the war started, he joined the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and flew for England during the next 6 years of war. Later met the woman who became his wife and didn't tell her about what he had done before the war. And those children growing up in foster homes, most of them knew nothing about who engineered our escape, who handled that. It was just sort of forgotten. And he had no reason to get in touch with children that he had saved 6 years before. I mean, that wouldn't look very good. And so he just, did his thing and became a great a stock broker and a philanthropist and a charitable organization founder, and just a great and celebrated man. But hardly anybody knew what he had done before the war until one day in 1988. This is 50 years after he started this effort. 50 years later, his wife is going through the attic and she finds a box full of documentation and a list of names and visa materials, and she doesn't know what this is all about. So she shows it to him and she says, "What's all this about?" And he finally tells her the story. Well, then it goes public and is thoroughly researched and documented, and ultimately he gets knighted by Queen Elizabeth. So when I came to know him late in his life, he was Sir Nicholas Winton, knighted by the Queen for saving 669 lives. I shared with Hannah Colquitt, excuse me, a link in which you'll find some more information about Winton and further links to, for instance, an article I wrote about him, but also references to a forthcoming movie that you might want to see when it makes its way to the United States. It will premiere in Toronto, Canada, this Friday. It's called One Life. It's got an all-star cast. Sir Anthony Hopkins plays Nicholas Winton. And it's going to tell the story of Nicky Winton in a dramatization, 2-hour movie. So I hope you'll want to see that when it comes to a theater near you. Nicky Winton, wonderful man. Every time I visited him with students, somebody would say, "Oh, Mr. Winton, just to be in your presence is so phenomenal. You're such a hero." And he would be quick to say, "Oh, no, don't call me that. I just did what I could." And that's what you find quite often with heroes. They're humble people. They didn't start out in life intending to be a hero. They just cultivated the character that one should have so as to be heroic when the right circumstances arise. And he was a man of integrity, a man of honesty, a man of compassion, a man of love for his fellow human beings. And when he saw a need, he sprung into action. And so that's an example of not just the difference that one person can make in terms of history, but the difference one can make in saving lives. Nicholas Winton, a great man who I miss tremendously in the 8 years since he passed away. I miss visiting him. So having said all that, we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. And Hannah will be fielding them, I guess, or putting them in the chat section. But I'm happy to answer what we can. I just clicked on it. Okay, here are two already. First one, how do people like Cicero and Cleveland know they are right or doing the right thing when people argue against them, especially with a career or their life on the line? Boy, that is a fantastic question. Yeah, both Cicero and Cleveland had so many people who opposed them, who said, "You're wrong, you're not doing the right thing, and stop doing that." But I think it goes back to personal character. In the case of both Cicero and Cleveland, there were things that they were so firmly committed to, they were not going to budge. I mean, these were things that they thought were just so right that you don't walk away from them, that you find yourself mustering the courage to defend at almost any cost. and in the case of Cicero, at the cost of his life. And one of the things that they felt very strongly about was what they regarded as truth. I mean, Cleveland vetoed all those bills, even though every bill had its own spokespersons and lobby groups and people who stood to benefit by them. But he vetoed them because in almost every case, he just saw them as cynical grabs from the Treasury by people who said, I'm special, I'm different, give me money. And Cleveland said, that's not the purpose of our government. You can't start doing that, or everybody's going to have their finger in the pie. That's just wrong. And so he was not deterred by having opponents, and neither was Cicero. And looking back, I mean, how could you argue that what Cicero was trying to preserve was not the right thing? I mean, he was trying to preserve individual liberty against the rise of dictators, bloody dictators. And I don't know what kind of a case you could make for them. So these guys really knew where they were coming from. They had some principles, and they were going to defend them. And that's a problem today with so many people who don't have principles. And they don't know where they stand, or they can be so easily dissuaded. If somebody comes along and says, oh, here's a few bucks, change your mind. Some people will do that, but not men or women of solid character like Cicero or Cleveland. Another question here. Did Nicholas not say anything because he would be arrested? No. He would not have been arrested because, of course, he was in Britain and was in the British military fighting against the Nazis. During the time he was arranging these rail transports, though, in Czechoslovakia, there were Nazis keeping an eye on him. Before the war broke out, they knew what he was doing, but they didn't feel as though they could act as they later did until there was a full-scale conflict. But I remember one of the students that I took to visit him asked him, when you were doing this in Prague and Germans were watching you, did you ever say anything to any of them? And he said yes. And I can't repeat what he said to the German Nazi official because it's it's the only word of profanity I ever heard from Nicholas Winton, but he said it right to the German's face. But for all those 50 years after the war, he didn't feel he could mention what he did because it just brought back memories of all the kids that he couldn't save. The 250 that he had at the rail station ready to go, but then the Nazis wouldn't let them leave. And all the other children that needed saving, but once the war started, he couldn't do it. So it just bothered his conscience so much he didn't want to talk about it. Maybe other people would have, but in his case, he just thought it was such an awful thing that he couldn't save others that he didn't want to relive it. Another question: why couldn't women work at night? That refers to the law passed in Connecticut that Vivian Kellams got the legislature to repeal. I'm not sure why they passed that. Certainly it was misinformation. I mean, they thought they were doing good things for women, but all they were doing was denying them an opportunity. I mean, women could choose to work after 10 if they wanted to. If they didn't want to, they weren't required to. Nobody forced them to. The legislature came in and said, well, just in case, we don't want any of them working after 10 p.m. And Vivian Kellams were right, I think, in saying you don't have any right to tell a woman she can't work at night. If she wants to, it's her business. Another question: why would countries say no to taking the children? Very good question. Keep in mind that in 1938, especially after the Munich Agreement, there was an international agreement that, we're not going to have war. We're going to respect the Nazi regime. They promised they won't go any further. And so these refugees are not in any difficulties. So this is not a problem. He's not going to go any further than the Sudetenland. Well, that was very naive. And people like Winton knew it was naive. They thought, you don't appease dictators like this. He's just going to come back for more. They were right, not the countries that said no, but even the United States said no. Franklin Roosevelt, our president, the White House sent a letter replying to Winton saying, sorry, we're unable to take any. it's a tragedy that the world didn't see the danger that they were truly in and opened their doors. But there was a ship after the war started of hundreds of Jewish people that got out and made their way, landed first in Florida and then several places along the American East Coast, hoping that America would accept them because they were clearly in obvious danger. And the US government refused to allow them to enter. So they ended up having to sail back to Europe to a port that would allow them in, and almost none of them survived. So that's a terrible episode in our history, that we weren't more open to accepting those endangered refugees. So that's the main reason. And there was some anti-Semitism on the part of a lot of countries. They thought, well, these are Jewish refugees and we don't want more Jews in our country. You know, an ugly anti-Semitic attitude that the world has experienced time and again over history. Okay, is there another question? We still have about 4 minutes. Well, if we're out of questions, let me just say, keep an eye out for that link that I know Hannah will provide, and you'll see a little bit more about, at least about Nikki Winton. But any of the people I spoke about, if you type their name into the search engine at fee.org, you will see at least one article about each of them, and in some cases, many more. But it's been a pleasure to be with you. Hannah, do you have anything further to say before we sign off?
I have one question, actually.
Okay.
And I was curious, when people were denying the refugees,
Yes.
did they assume that the refugees were not in any danger, or did they understand the exact circumstances of what these refugees were facing?
I think it depends. There were some who were alert and who had their ear to the ground, knew what was happening in Europe, knew what Hitler was all about, and didn't believe he could be placated, who just turned a blind eye. They just couldn't muster the courage or the integrity to say, yes, let's get these children in here. They were maybe a little naive, thinking that as dire as the situation looks, maybe things will work out. Maybe they'll find another place somewhere else to go. You know, all bad reasons. And probably many of those people who said no, many of those countries that said no, if you were to go back 5 years later and say, now, don't you wish you had said yes? They'd probably say, yeah, we were wrong. And we had a Holocaust that killed 6 million people, some of whom we could have saved if we had accepted them. So I think just a lot of different reasons, but and other people just thought, hey, it's none of our business. Let the rest of the world deal with it. And we're all the way over here in the United States. What do we care about these European affairs? Which is like sticking your head in the sand. But I'm happy to say one country, Dominican Republic, a tiny little country in the Caribbean, they came forward in 1938 and said, we'll take 100,000 refugees here in the Dominican Republic, a country of only 1.5 million people. They said they would take 100,000. Australia said they would take 15,000, but those numbers are a pittance. There were potentially several millions of people who were sooner or later going to become refugees or prisoners.
Thank you so much, Larry. It's been a wonderful webinar.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Hannah. And thanks to all the students. I appreciate your tuning in. See you next time.